Why the law? Why it has a reputation of being amazingly difficult? Was it abolished at the cross? And do we need to follow it today? We live in a modern society with a lot of laws and regulations. No one is surprised about the idea of having the law, and in fact, we welcome the law as it helps us to know the boundaries of behavior and helps us to adapt into the society. It's common sense to us to why it's important to have the law. The law Yahweh gave to Moses at the Mount Sinai also had a similar purpose, to help Israelites to function, to know the boundaries, to live together, but also to know how to serve and worship God. After being saved from the slavery in Egypt, Israelites spent 40 years in the wilderness to unlearn what they have learned in Egypt, to remove all their bad habits and practices. And as we are creatures of habit, this takes time. The law was a result of being saved, not as a measure to be saved. The law was helping Israelites to be shaped into the holy vessels that the God originally created. Yet Egypt, through their practices, defiled those holy vessels. However, at some point this opinion that the law is difficult to follow, impossible for anyone to keep, and therefore everyone will fail in God, has been created throughout the history. Listen to the New Testament scholar Dr. Bart Ehrman on this subject.
Talking about the Jewish law, whether it's possible to keep it and what the New Testament authors have to say about it. Did the Jews of the time know that they had a problem keeping the law, or is this something that other people decided for them?
Yeah, well, kind of other people sort of decided this for them, I think, because they, within the Jewish tradition, historically and still today, the law that God gave to Moses on Mount Sinai is seen as the greatest good that you could imagine, and that it's a joy to keep. And I think the logic is precisely the opposite of what I learned when I was young. The logic of the law is not that God requires you to keep the law so that you can be saved. That's how I thought Jews thought about the law. They didn't. The law was not given so that you could be saved. The law was given because you were saved. And the logic is that God chose the people of Israel, and he saved them from their slavery in Egypt. And immediately afterwards, he gave them his law so that they would know how to worship him and how to behave toward one another. And, a lot of people in the world wonder, people who are religious want to know, what's the best way to worship and serve God. And just about everybody wonders, what should I do to behave? What is the right way to live? And in the Jewish tradition, God has told you both things. The ruler of the universe has laid it out for you. How good can it be? The things you want to know are given to you. And so it was seen as a source of joy, to keep it. So the idea that, you had to keep it as this burden and nobody could do it and it brought guilt, that's a later formulation put on the Jewish law, not one that emerges out of the law itself. If you look at the Hebrew Bible and you look at how God gives the law to Moses and Israel, it sounds just almost exactly like a suzerainty treaty. It's like the sovereign telling the one who's now submissive to the Lord what they need to do. And then you have the list of, you right off the bat, you get the 10 Commandments, but then you get everything else. And throughout you get this thing, you do this, you'll be blessed. If you don't, you'll be cursed. And so the idea is you've already submitted to the lordship of God, and he's already saved you. And now these are the stipulations.
A lot of modern laws are designed to keep society functioning in a certain way, protect its members, protect certain institutions. What was the purpose of the Jewish law handed down by Yahweh?
Well, that was certainly one of them. I think if you look at all the laws in the Old Testament, there were three functions for these laws. One are laws about how to worship God. And worshiping God entails things like, how you perform sacrifices to God and what special days you observe, observing the Sabbath, for example, and observing festivals. And this is how you'll do it. And these are how you do the sacrifices and things. So you have these things about how to worship God. The second is you have how to relate in community to one another. You've got to have community laws. And so you shouldn't steal from your neighbor. You shouldn't commit adultery. You shouldn't murder. But also there are laws that are not just kind of telling you what to do and what not to do. There are also laws like, if this happens, then this is the punishment. So those are all community laws. So you have laws about how to worship God, community laws, and then you have things that you might call purity laws about how the people of God are to remain pure before God, ritually pure. But those are the three kinds of things, and there's nothing particularly crazily difficult about any of them. They're just, this is how this nation is going to be organized.
How the authors of the New Testament differed in their views on Jewish law, or do we see a relatively coherent depiction of it?
I think that the view presented in the Gospel of Matthew, for example, is very different from the view that you find in the writings of Paul. So much so that I'm not sure they would have agreed. The basic story is that in Matthew's Gospel, Jesus insists that his followers have to keep the law. He didn't come to abolish it. He came to fulfill it. And his followers have to keep it better than the scribes and Pharisees do, better than the really religious folk among the Jews. You've got to keep the law. Paul says explicitly, especially about Gentiles, you don't have to keep the law. In fact, you shouldn't try to keep the law. I think this is probably the biggest contrast. So, a view represented by Matthew and a view represented by Paul. Part of the opposition to the law in the Gospels generally is an opposition to a certain way of interpreting the law. When Jesus gets in conflicts, it's almost never about the law itself. It's about how Pharisees are interpreting the law. And so many people think that Jesus goes through the Gospels and he's always breaking the law because it doesn't matter anymore. And it's not true. The most pointed case is Jesus breaking the Sabbath. People say, well, Jesus didn't care about the Sabbath. He's breaking it the whole time. And actually, it's not true. If you look at what happens, Jesus will do something on the Sabbath and the Pharisees will object to it. You can't do that on the Sabbath. And Jesus will point out that actually what he's doing is helping people, and that's okay according to the law. They have a different interpretation of what it means to keep the law. Specifically, what does it mean to keep the Sabbath law? And we don't see this today because we're not in the ancient Jewish context. But in the ancient Jewish context, there were all sorts of debates about what it means to keep the law. Like, what does it mean to keep the Sabbath? So if it says don't work on the Sabbath, okay, fair enough. Don't work on the Sabbath. Great. But what's work? And it depends. Is shoveling your sidewalk because of the snow work on the Sabbath? So you can't do that on a Saturday? Well, some Jews would say, well, yes, you can't. Well, they weren't shoveling snow, but they say, but you can't do this on the Sabbath because that's work. And others would say, well, actually, that's not work. And so they have debates about it. Jesus gets in conflicts about the Sabbath, not because he's actually breaking what the law says, but because he's violating what the Pharisees think the law says, how they interpret the law. So there's no place I don't think there's any place in the Gospels, in the Matthew, Mark, and Luke, where Jesus actually, violates what the law tells you to do. On the Sermon on the Mount, you have this passage called the antitheses, where Jesus will quote one of the laws and then give his interpretation of it. And an antithesis is a contrary statement. So you've heard it said, you shall not commit murder, but I say to you, and so he's giving a kind of a contrary statement. It's not a contradictory statement, but it's like it's standing over against the other thing. And so I say to you, you should not even get angry. And that is getting to the heart of the law. I mean, the reason you murder somebody is because you're really ticked off about something. Well, don't get ticked off about something and you won't murder. And so it's getting to the very heart of what the law is. So when the law says an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, Jesus says turn the other cheek. Now, people often say, well, okay, so, he's reversing that law because, but no, he's actually not. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth means that the punishment should be appropriate to the crime. So in other words, if somebody knocks out your tooth, you don't lop off their head. And so it's a law for mercy and justice. And Jesus then just takes it farther. Not only don't lop off his head, don't even take out his tooth, and so he extends the law of mercy even further. And so I think that is trying to get to the very heart of the law, because for Matthew, the very heart of the law is that you should love one another and treat them the way you want them to treat you. And if you do that, you will keep the law. And interestingly, and again, a little weirdly, Paul says something similar. Paul says that you should love your neighbor as yourself because that fulfills the law. And you think, well, that's a weird thing for Paul to say because he's just been saying you don't have to keep the law. but now he says, love your neighbor. That fulfills the law. And so they all pretty much agree. Jesus, Matthew, Paul, they all pretty much agree that the core of the law is to love. And that becomes the distinctive Christian message.
If Jesus is coming into conflict with the Pharisees over their particular interpretation of the law, how does he seem to think people should be following it?
Well, okay, so this is the thing this is really a key thing in Matthew. So there's this man who comes up to Jesus, and this is in Mark as well, but Matthew has the story where this man comes up to Jesus and says, "What must I do to have eternal life?" And Jesus says, "Keep the commandments." What? He doesn't say, "Believe in me." Don't accept my death and resurrection that are going to happen, or anything, or think I'm the one who came down from heaven. It's nothing about me. It's keep the commandments. And so, Jesus certainly thought, in Matthew, and I think in the other gospels too, that you should, if you're Jewish, especially, you should keep the law. But then in Matthew later, Jesus gets asked, well, what really is the law all about? And Jesus says the greatest commandment of the law is you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength. So that's from Deuteronomy chapter 6. And love God with everything. And he says, and there's a second law that's just as important, second commandment, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Leviticus 19:18. And then he says, on these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. So Jesus, I think this actually goes back to Jesus, this kind of concept. It's also found in his statement of the golden rule that you should do to other people what you want them to do to you. And he says, for this is the law and the prophets. And so he thought that actually behaving in loving ways toward God and toward others is what the law is really about. And it's not so much about how much you should tithe or what sacrifices you should perform. It's about taking care of human needs. And so he saw that as a fulfillment of the law, and he wasn't alone in that. There are other Jewish teachers who thought the same thing.
So if Jesus is seemingly viewing the law as something that you should be keeping, it is possible to keep it, why, or maybe how do we get this idea that the Jewish law is amazingly hard to keep and it's not possible?
There's nothing particularly overly complicated about the Jewish law. It is nothing as complicated as American law. I was reading the other day that there are 1,091,000 federal regulations, just federal law. Forget like a state law and your city's laws and things. You're talking over 1 million laws. And in the Old Testament, there's 613 of them. So 613 versus 1 million, take your pick. And it's not. It's not impossible to avoid murdering somebody. You can decide not to do that. Virtually everything in there is keepable.
Are there any texts in the Old Testament that kind of help augment our views on this at all?
Throughout the Hebrew Bible, especially in the prophets, but also in the book of Deuteronomy, there are a number of passages that talk about how God gets angry when you violate his law, and the kind of curses that come as a result of violating the law. And in the prophets, you have these kind of wholesale statements about how the people of Israel have broken the law. They're talking to their own situation, and they're trying to explain why Israel is experiencing so many problems, including military defeat, if God is supposed to protect them. And their explanation is because, God gave you the law and you didn't keep it. And so Christians then end up picking that up and saying, see, Israel never keeps its law. Jews don't keep the law. Jews can't keep the law. And it kind of leads to this point of view. But at the same time, even like in Matthew himself, Matthew cites the law to show that Jesus fulfills the law. And so you have this uneasy tension within Christianity that on one hand, you have people saying you don't have to keep the law, but yet they keep the law as part of their scriptures. And, so it's this kind of uneasy balance between, well, what is our relationship to the Old Testament? What's our relationship to the law? And as I was saying, I think, Matthew and Paul have they have different answers to that with respect to salvation itself, because Matthew thinks keeping the law is all part of following Jesus. And Paul does not. Jesus himself says only in Matthew that I've not come to abolish the law. I've come to fulfill it. And he goes on to say that his followers have to keep the law better than the scribes and Pharisees. And so that's in the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, chapter 5. But then later in chapter 23, Jesus tells his disciples that the scribes and Pharisees pronounce on the law and that what they say is right and you should do what the Pharisees say. The problem with the Pharisees is they don't do what they say. They don't practice what they preach. So that's an astounding statement in Matthew 23, verse 2, that you should keep what the Pharisees tell you to do. And so, but Jews are still bound to keep the law because it's the law God gave gave to the Jews. Paul has a much more relaxed view, and he absolutely does not say you have to keep the law, let alone the way the Pharisees had interpreted it. What ends up happening is, because Paul says that salvation comes through Christ, not through the law, let me elaborate for a second, that it's not clear that he's telling Jews that they don't have to keep the law. He's telling Gentiles, don't convert to Judaism, because converting to Judaism isn't what matters. What matters is accepting Christ's death and resurrection. And he himself does say that when he's with Jews, he's a Jew, and when he's with Gentiles, he's a Gentile, which means he broke the law when it was convenient for his mission, when it helped his mission to convert people. And so the law is not the major thing for him. But what ends up happening is so many more people convert who are Gentiles than Jews, and they see that the Jewish law can't bring salvation. They see that Jews have rejected their own Messiah, in their opinion. There begins this kind of anti-Jewish element within Christianity. I don't think Paul himself is anti-Jewish. I really don't think that at all. But I do think that later on, then people started saying, well, look, Jews got this law, and, it's ridiculous. They can't. And so the law itself becomes an object of attack by Christians. And soon you hear Christians saying that it's a real burden to keep the law, and Jews hate having to do it, but they've got to do it. And, if they would just see that Christ solves the problem. So in effect, this whole thing leads to a kind of anti-Judaism within Christianity, where the Jewish faith is maligned and Jews who keep it are maligned, and it leads eventually to very nasty things in the history of anti-Judaism.
Therefore, the law was a result of salvation, not to be saved. The idea that the law was a measure of salvation came through religious practices of the Pharisees, who misinterpreted the law. Their interpretation and strict rules created this hostility towards the law. That is why Jesus came to show everyone that it's possible to keep the law, that it's not a burden, and that they are looking at it wrong. He showed us that we fulfill it through the love towards God and towards human needs. He also didn't reduce the law to only 2 commandments, as many people believe, but summarized the essence of the law into 2 main points. It was just a summary, not a reduction. However, every time he was asked about the law, he was listing all the commandments. Then Apostle Paul confused people even more by separating that Jews have to follow the law and Gentiles don't have to follow the law. Again, only by his interpretation. He was insisting that he received this mysterious knowledge, that he is above others, and that only he understands this mystery. But again, that was his interpretation. But God was very clear that his law was an everlasting covenant, therefore lasting forever. If you want to follow into footsteps of Jesus, and if you want to worship God, you have to follow the law as it's written. That also includes observing the Sabbath, which is from Friday sundown to Saturday sundown. If you keep insisting on the Sunday as according to you, the day doesn't matter. You are taking away God's authority, which God clearly said. Surely my Sabbaths you shall keep, for it is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you might know that I am the Lord who sanctifies you. You shall keep the Sabbath, therefore, for it is holy to you. Everyone who profanes it shall surely be put to death. For whoever does any work on it, that person shall be cut off from among his people. Work shall be done for 6 days, but the 7th is the Sabbath of rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does any work on the Sabbath day, he shall surely be put to death. Therefore the children of Israel shall keep the Sabbath, to observe the Sabbath throughout their generations as a perpetual covenant. It is a sign between me and the children of Israel forever. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, and on the 7th day he rested and was refreshed. Exodus 31, verse 13 to 17. Why do you even argue with God by insisting that it doesn't matter which day it is? How can you be sure that you are not worshipping the enemy on Sunday? How can you be sure that all that worship doesn't go in vain because it's not on the appointed day? While we are on earth, we don't understand spiritual implications. We can't see spirits, and we can't be sure that this doesn't matter to God. In fact, it's very arrogant to think that you know that God wouldn't mind. It's dangerous to believe men's words like Apostle Paul, like Catholic Church institution who change the day, like pastors and preachers who say God loves you anyway and it doesn't matter. Listen to God's words only that are from everlasting to everlasting.